students, this is Miss Anna, and we are going to talk about reading Shakespeare like an actor. In response to this lecture, rather than answering a question I asked, you get to ask any question you like about theater, about Shakespeare's time, about the Globe Theater, about being an actor today, or being an actor in Shakespeare's lifetime, and I will do my best to answer. Alright, here we go. So the first thing, before we actually look at the text and start thinking, okay, putting on our thinking caps and reading the text like an actor, what you need to know is that theater in Shakespeare's time was very different than it is today. Today, you know, you get all gussied up, it's a special night out, theater's pretty expensive, you know, you go into the big fancy theater space, you walk through the door with your little ticket, someone takes the ticket from you, punches it, and says, hey, you know, your seat is down there on the right, just go down there, don't trip over the steps. You know, we'll if you're very old, we'll usher you down and make sure you get seated comfortably in these big, poofy, comfy seats. You're sitting there, you're talking to your friends, you might be eating a candy bar, and you know, the lights go down and you're like, oh, it's so cool, you know, we're going to see a show. The lights go down, the lights come up on stage, there might be a huge orchestra. You can't really see the people around you, the actors can't really see you because the lights are in their eyes, and you know, it's an incredibly different experience than it would have been in Shakespeare's time. In Shakespeare's time, theaters were almost always open air. They would be shaped like a huge corral at a rodeo, and the theaters were literally a huge O. The very poor people would stand on the ground. They were called groundlings. Listen for groundlings in Hamlet. He does mention them. The richer people would sit here, and the most rich people would sit up here in these painted stalls right by the stage. And you might think, well, but can they really see from up here? No, they can't. But if you were incredibly rich, you went to the theater to be seen, not actually to see the show. And quite often, the groundlings would come to the theater to see the rich people as much as to see the show. There would be this huge kind of tower thing at the back of the theater that would include the stage that the actors would play on. It would have a place to enter, a place to exit. There might be a balcony here in the back that the actors would use. They would have live music. They would have recorders and bagpipes and a form of the guitar. They would just have these different kind of smaller instruments. Pianos hadn't been invented yet. You see this flag up here? The color of the flag would tell audience members what kind of play was being shown today, whether it was a tragedy or a comedy or a history. You were always, as an actor, you were always really close to the audience. And because it's open air, you're dependent on the sun shining for you to be able to perform. You might not do that many shows a day, you might do 1 or 2 shows a day. You are 100% dependent on the sun shining. It wasn't until a little bit later in Shakespeare's life that indoor theaters became a reality. And even then, they were dependent on candlelight to be, you know, to actually light the stage so that actors could be seen. Sometimes a monarch, a king or a queen, would invite a company of men or a company of actors to come perform for them in the palace. That was a really big deal, number one. Number two, they would have the candlelight to say, okay, yeah, you can totally come over at 7 o'clock tonight and we'll see a show. Yay! Being a groundling was an experience. You paid about, you know, 5-6 pence to get in, which was quite a lot of money at the time. And the ground was covered in sawdust. You would walk in, you would be standing on the sawdust for, you know, about 3 hours, because the plays were about 3 hours long. If you needed to go to the bathroom and you were right by the stage, you probably didn't really bother to kind of fight your way through the crowd to get to the back and get out to the privy. You would just, you know, squat, take care of your business, and not really worry about it, especially if you were a gent. You could buy oranges and sweetmeats, ribbons at the plays as well. And I wouldn't be surprised, I mean, we don't really know, but I wouldn't be surprised if all of that stuff was being sold during the show. So the actors were often having to yell over all kinds of noise if the actors weren't very good. And remember, you know, they are so close to the audience. They're probably about 3 feet away from the audience members. If you weren't very good, the audience will throw things at you. They will throw rotten food. They will throw the oranges. You know, it's kind of fierce. It's kind of fierce. If you're great, fantastic. But if you're not, to this day, actors who perform on the recreation of the Globe either love it or they really, really hate it because it's kind of scary. You know exactly what the audience thinks of you, basically. Right, I told you that inside theaters came about near the end of Shakespeare's life. Here is an American recreation in Stanton, Virginia that you can go watch shows at. It's really, really cool. You have seats along the side of the stage, so again, you're really, really close to the actors. You have your balcony, you have your entrance and exit. Here's your candlelight. Even if you're, you know, right in front of the stage where the groundlings would stand, you get benches, so it's a much, much nicer experience. Oh man, some things that you need to know. I mean, firstly, you need to know that at the time, actors were not very well respected. If you were an actor, you couldn't be buried in a churchyard because what you were doing was a profane art. You were basically lying on stage. That's the way it seemed at the time. Women were not allowed to perform at all. It was against the law. Actors were given a special dispensation by the law to be allowed to dress above their station so that they could be kings and queens. In fact, if it hadn't been for the kings and queens at the time who really liked theater, you know, Elizabeth I really loved theater and really loved Shakespeare, we probably wouldn't have, theater probably would have been wiped out at Shakespeare's time, because the people in charge of the city of London they were coming from a very strict Protestant point of view. So they said, you know what, theater is a bad influence on the populace. You know, it's showing murder, it's showing illegal acts, it's showing stealing. This is a bad influence, and we don't want it in London anymore. So during Shakespeare's time, there was a law passed that there could be no theater in London. So Shakespeare, who by this point, just to catch you up on Shakespeare, Shakespeare had moved from his little hometown in Stratford-upon-Avon, which you can still go to. It's a beautiful town. And he had moved down to London. He had started out at the very bottom of a theater company as an actor. He started to, you know, write as well as perform. And eventually he became one of the leaders of his own theater company, which ended up being called the King's Men, I believe. Yes. He was sponsored by the Queen. You know, he got to the point where they were sponsored by the Queen, when the Queen said, okay, you guys are great enough that you are now mine. And that was a really big deal, because the monarch would give them money, would make sure that, would protect them to a certain degree from the people in charge of big cities like London, who said, you know, I'm sorry, but theater is a bad influence. So when they said that, Shakespeare and his men took timber from a theater called The Theater. Very creative name for a theater. They took lumber from this theater, took it over the River Thames. So they were technically in a different borough. They weren't really in the city of London. And they built their own theater called the Globe. If you go to a theater today, you know, it's very high-tech. You hear piped-in music, pre-recorded music. You know, you can have explosions happen on stage. You can have these wonderful light changes. At the time, everything was of course not as advanced. If you wanted a cannon sound to happen during your show, you actually needed a cannon. So just going back to this picture from Shakespeare's time, look up here. See those two little holes? Out of one of those holes was sticking a cannon mouth. And that's because if a king needed to enter down on the stage, they would actually shoot off an actual cannon with actual gunpowder and actual flame to announce this actor appearing as a monarch. So during a show, they shut off the cannon and caught this part of the theater on fire. This would have been straw. The globe was made out of, big timbers, and just the method of building at the time was incredibly flammable. So when they shot off the cannon, boom, the globe caught on fire. And it was many years, until the 1980s, when finally someone said, we should rebuild the globe. That would be a great idea. In fact, it was an American named Sam Wanamaker, and if you're interested, you can look him up. But he was incredibly instrumental in rebuilding the globe that you can go visit today on the south bank of the Thames. All right, what was I saying? Oh yes, if you go to theater today, big scenery, very elaborate scenery. All that Shakespeare's actors had was this, right here, which never changed. It was always 2 doors, a balcony, a stage. That's it. So that's why at the beginning of a scene, quite often the first line is something to do with, wow, this is a beautiful forest, isn't it? Or, whoa, the moon's really big tonight. Because at the very beginning, you need to let the audience know where they are. Your costumes would have been a lot like what the people were wearing around you. So there's a lot to be said for, making sure that you call the character by their name. You give just as much as the play today, you need to give information about the characters you're talking to. Women were not allowed to perform on stage. It was against the law. And so young boys whose voices hadn't changed yet to deeper manly voices would perform the women's parts. And there was nothing weird about that. Because from the very beginning, you're 3 feet from the audience member. The audience member isn't going to wonder if this is really happening. They already know from the very beginning of the show when someone would come out and say, welcome to our show, welcome to the Globe Theatre, we're going to be performing Hamlet by William Shakespeare tonight. And at the very end of a lot of these shows, the same person would come out and say, thank you for coming to our show, I hope it wasn't that bad. They really would say that. And if you go to the end of Midsummer Night's Dream, Puck, the fairy character, has a speech that's basically saying, if this was really awful, we're so sorry, but at least, we're just spirits. We're just spirits. So it's perfectly fine. This didn't really happen. Here's the big idea I want you to carry away from the background to Shakespeare's writings. Shakespeare it's based on words, right? Plays are words, but rather than words being necessarily written down and committed to books, these wonderful, huge books today of William Shakespeare's complete works, at the time it was completely oral. And they just didn't have the technology to really make these stories come alive apart from the language. Not just the language, what the words meant, but how the words sounded. You did not have the really cool fog effects to make Hamlet's father's ghost seem scary. The language had to make the father's ghost seemed scary. And yes, acting was a part of that, but what was really special is that Shakespeare's language was enough to make the story come alive. Okay, yay! Alright, so that's background on Shakespeare.